you all for joining the program. I'm here with author and magician Penn Jillette. Penn, we're talking today about your work with Vera Simulators?
Back in the 90s, Janet Reno, who was
Attorney
General for
the United States.
President Bill Clinton. Remember the Waco thing? That was Janet Reno.
There was an attack on the compound?
Yeah. Well, she was very anti-video game, as was Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton and Arnold Schwarzenegger and, your dad, everybody. So she gave a speech where she said that they should have video games that dealt with regular jobs, prepare people for the workplace. So her idea for video games was that the video games would be educational. Now, by educational, what Janet Reno means is making you a proletariat, getting you as a worker. And she said instead of, simulators that we usually have, like tanks and planes and race cars and submarines and hedgehogs, they would get you ready for a real job. So she stated this, and I was listening with Eddie Gorodetsky, who writes on situation comedies. He writes on 2.5 Men, and he writes on, Mom is his show. He created that show, and we're on Letterman and Saturday Night Live, and also was writing with us on this video game called Smoke and Mirrors. And Eddie said that we both heard the Janet Reno speech together, and we were laughing about how stupid it was. And Eddie said, well, let's do what she wants us to do. So Eddie said the idea Desert Bus, and then we brainstormed on it. And the idea was for Janet Reno, we would give you a chance to actually learn what it would be like to drive a bus 360 miles from Tucson, Arizona to Las Vegas, Nevada. 45 miles per hour maximum speed. It takes 8 hours to drive it if you do it right. And there's a little bit of a pull to the right. It's not glamorous, it's not pretty, it's not exciting. It's real. And we put this out, and I think a bug hits the windshield at one point, like 4 hours in. You just drive. And it pulls to the right. And if you go off the road, it just overheats, and then you get towed back in real time. And you get 1 point for doing an 8-hour shift. So, mind-numbingly real. I should also point out that you can open and close the door to the bus, but no one's in any of the bus stops. You can't get on, no one gets on, no one gets off. You just drive the bus. So Randy Pitchford at Gearbox, well, first of all, Desert Bus never came out.
It was created but never distributed?
That's right, never came out. I think the company that put out Desert Bus, there was a market correction and they went out of business.
So how is it possible that it is a known entity being recreated for this project?
Well, let me tell you. The reason is that it was bootlegged. It came out, and it got very popular in its bootleg form. People, it leaked, and they started putting it on different platforms. And this group of Canadians started a thing called Desert Bus for Hope. And they raised money for Child's Play, which
It's a charity.
That buys video games for children in hospitals for a long time. And they started driving Desert Bus for charity for 50 hours at a time, just racking up those points. They got like 5, 6, 7 points, amazing numbers. And we would send them pizzas and stuff. And Randy Pitcher had heard about that and wanted to put out Desert Bus 2.0, VR version. He wanted full VR. So he bought the bus. As a matter of fact, if you're listening to this, they're going to be using it on the bus. So this will be the first thing you'll hear on your radio. And they bought the bus.
That's exciting.
And they scanned it. And if you are listening to this on the bus now, you've been going, 5, 10 minutes. You get pretty much 8 hours still to go. Radio is not going to get that good a reception. Eddie also had other ideas that we turned down for his
Part of these Terra simulators?
Yeah, simulator. He wanted to do toll collector. We do an 8-hour shift as a toll collector. Portrait sitter, which I thought was a really good one. You sit, have your portrait drawn, and bird watcher, which I rejected bird watcher as being way, way too interesting. You don't make money bird watching, you know.
No.
So 360 miles, you probably got now, the speed you're going, you probably got 355 miles to go. You'll be driving a little bit. And we got it really, really accurate.
Do you think you will accomplish Janet Reno's suggestion?
Well, the question is, someone who does Desert Bus, would they then be prepared to drive a Desert Bus? No. Much like when you play any of these games she doesn't like, you're not qualified to use a weapon. You don't know how to load a gun, or you're hitting buttons. That's not the way guns run. You know how guns run?
I've never fired a weapon.
You have to load them and stuff. So you don't know how to do any of the stuff you see in a video game. You don't really know how to do it. I don't know. Do you think if someone does a simulator on an airplane, that if you're flying in a commercial airliner and the pilot goes unconscious, you can take over? I think there's a Flight of the Phoenix is a movie where they're trying to get out of the place and they built an airplane, and turns out the guy who builds the airplane only built model airplanes before. I think that's the big punchline.
I'm not familiar with the work.
Why would you be? I don't think it was a very successful movie. They remade it though. It wasn't successful there. I think Hugh Laurie was in the remake.
Is there
I didn't see it.
any thought given to the luggage capacity on this bus?
Well, you have a bus.
Right.
Randy scanned the bus.
So that you'd be able to open the bottom compartment?
I don't think you can. I think you just sit in the seat. But Randy bought a bus, and they scanned the bus in. So this one should be very accurate. See, Randy wanted to call the Desert Bus 2.0. And I wanted to call it Desert Bus 1.002. Because I wanted there to be a lot of room for big improvements. But Randy says that this is, I haven't done it yet when we're recording this, but Randy says it'll be great. So this is what Janet Reno wants out of a video game.
How successful does the game have to be for Gearbox for us to anticipate Toll Collector or Portrait Sitter?
I don't know. It seems like it'd have to be pretty successful. By the way, this version is set up to only be for charity. I don't think we're selling this. It's going to be, most people that are hearing this now will be playing for charity. I just want you to know, is the charity worth how long you're going to sit here? It'll be a really, really long time. Did you ever play Desert Bus?
I've only watched others play.
Yeah. For 8 hours?
I don't think I made the duration of the trip.
Yeah, 8 hours in a bus, driving, pulls to the right.
What is the longest you've played it?
a minute and a half. I wouldn't get to this part. Minute and a half, maybe. Maybe 2.
What is the longest you've driven any kind of vehicle?
I've driven across the country a few times. I went with Eddie Gorodetsky, as a matter of fact. We drove a U-Haul trailer from Los Angeles to New York. We drove the whole way. At the time, Eddie Gorodetsky didn't have a license, so I drove the whole way, and he was just sitting there. And we wrote a script during that time called I Came from Space. And we wrote it while we were driving, and we turned it into the production company that had commissioned it. And we got a great comment on it. The producer said to us, I don't think I could have understood this less if it were written in another language. Actually said that. There's some damage done from driving for hours and hours and hours and hours, and this is damage that if you're listening to this, you'll be doing to yourself. At some point, I think a bug will hit the windshield. I don't want to get you too excited, but I think it's going to happen somewhere along the line.
And is that based on a true event?
The bug? Yeah. Bugs hit the windshields. They do. They do. Bugs hit the windshields. Or, I don't know, maybe the windshield hits the bug. I guess that's true, isn't it? What do we call what hits what? You see that the windshield, the bug compared to the bus is almost stationary, right?
Have any animal rights groups contacted you or Gearbox upset with the treatment of bugs in the game?
Well, it's a virtual bug. We all think we scanned an actual bug. I don't think a bug was hurt. I don't know. But if they have a problem with it, we can take the bug out of the desert bus.
Seems like a lot of thought was put into the bus and the dimensions of the bus and getting the bus accurate, but not so much so with the bug that hits the windshield.
Yeah, actually, I just said the word bug. I didn't even think about what kind of bug. I just said bug.
Whether it should be accurate to a desert environment, the kind of bug that would hit your windshield in the desert.
It should be, shouldn't it, really? Although now, with all these, we've moved species all around the world. There's all these species that are endemic. I mean, maybe if the bug looks like it is not a bug that's endemic to the natural environment, that you could just maybe think that bus came over, the bug came over on a, hitchhiking on a airliner or something, and maybe it's not going to be able to reproduce, or maybe it will reproduce like that. What's that weed that kind of took over California?
I'm not aware.
Okay, the cane toads in Australia, you know about that?
No.
How about those mollusks that took over the river in New York?
I'm not aware.
Yeah, a lot of times a species, a plant is not a bug, or a frog is not a bug, but sometimes a species will get into. I believe the rats that we have in New York are Norwegian rats originally. Now they live here, and I believe that the cockroaches that we have here, there's American cockroaches, and there's the Madagascar hissing roaches sold some patent that they get out into the system. I wanted to get some stick insects for my tank at home. Do you know what stick insects are?
I've seen them, yeah.
They're big. I mean, for insects.
They're not typically kept as a pet.
They are kept as pets. Pretty often in the UK. There's a show they had in the UK. This is true. Called That's My Stick Insect. It was a department on a show. It wasn't the whole show. And they got 3 people who owned stick insects as pets and put their stick insects in cages that were not labeled, different cages. And if the people could identify their stick insect, they were to win a lot of money. They couldn't do it. But I used to have stick insects. in my home here in Vegas. I loved them. They're about, the length of a hot dog, and they look like a stick, but they're really an insect. And they like to eat eucalyptus leaves, but I wanted to get some for the tank we have now because I thought the children would enjoy them. And stick insects, you have to be very careful. You have to have a special license for a stick insect. The double O is the license to kill. The license to own a stick insect is a different number. It's not like 007 owns stick insects. Maybe like 342 license to own stick insect. I just made up that number. But it's not a stick insect, but they're afraid that the stick insects get out into the wild, that we might have more stick insects than we want. I'm a guy that wants stick insects, but there's still probably a limit on the number.
We are taking a break from my interview with Penn Jillette to invite you to become a sponsor. So please support the station any way you can. If you enjoy interviews like the one we're hearing now, please consider being a sponsor for our programming, either online or over the telephone. And now more with Penn Jillette, author and magician.
And also one of the creators of Desert Bus, although it was Eddie Gordetsky's original idea. Eddie, I talked to Eddie and he said he had a lot of credits, but he certainly wanted the credit on Desert Bus. Here's the thing that I find interesting on Desert Bus is we've been talking maybe 15 minutes. There's really nothing else to say that I can think of. And there's probably another 7 hours and 45 minutes of driving the bus.
Should drivers of the automobile be concerned about...
It's not an automobile, it's a bus.
Oh, thank you.
It's a bus. It's called Desert Bus.
Yes.
It's not called Desert Automobile. Desert Bus.
Should drivers of the Desert Bus...
It's a bus. It's a bus.
...be concerned about their petroleum levels?
I think we go on one tank all the way. I think it's one tank. I don't think we put that in, although maybe, this highfalutin Desert Bus, who knows what they might have built in. But I think, you're talking about 360 miles, seems like a bus could do 360 on one tank of gas. Then you maybe refuel, then you go back the other way.
I don't know, what about there's no bio brake or anything for the driver?
No. It's, the rest areas are like 200 miles apart. I think you have to find someone else to take the joystick in with you when you're relieving yourself. You can hold the joystick, hold a little bit to the left so it doesn't pull to the right. But mostly it's just meant to be as tedious as real life.
And it's from Vegas or to Vegas?
Well, it's both. You start out in Tucson, drive to Vegas, get to Vegas, drive to Tucson, get to Tucson, drive to Vegas, get to Vegas, drive to Tucson, get to Tucson, drive to Vegas, get to Vegas, drive to Tucson, get to Tucson, drive to Vegas. Then you go from Vegas to Tucson. Then you get to Tucson, you go back to Vegas. Well, it's not really back to Vegas because you started out in Tucson. So then your aim is back in Vegas to, I lost track.
I think we were at Tucson.
Go to Vegas. Get to Vegas, go to Tucson. And we're supposed to, we're hoping to use the Desert Bus that we bought to scan to actually drive from Tucson to Vegas in a non-simulator but a real Desert Bus. And then for the highest score people on this game, we'll all get together, like 50 of us, and drive in the Desert Bus really to Vegas and then see the Penn and Teller show.
That would be exciting.
Really exciting. Vegas. That would just be Tucson to Vegas.
Right.
We wouldn't do Vegas to Tucson after.
You were done.
No, just Tucson to Vegas.
If I'm on the bus and I parked in Tucson and I went to Vegas, my car's now still in Tucson.
Maybe there's another app we can learn called Ridesharer. You can virtually drive from Las Vegas in like a Lyft or an Uber or something back to Tucson.
My actual car is in Tucson.
Well, the virtual car would be, the actual car's in Tucson. We'd have to drive, maybe you'd have to get a real ride share back. Or maybe a bus. Because this is a route that a real bus would drive. Or maybe, what kind of car you have?
It's a Toyota Corolla.
What year?
2011.
What kind of mileage you got on that?
I'm approaching 80,000.
I mean the miles on it. What kind of mileage, like miles per gallon?
Highway or regular?
Well, the Tucson to...
It would be highway.
Highway mostly, yeah.
You can get up to 35.
Really?
Yeah.
Did you ever drive one of those Priuses?
I have driven a Prius, yeah.
What do they get?
Certainly more.
Yeah, more by a lot.
Who are the Penn and Teller of Tucson? Just the Penn and Teller. Right. But if I drive back to Tucson, I also want to see a show.
I'd maybe see a movie. I don't think they have a thriving theater community. Maybe they do. I don't know. But if you ask me who the Penn and Teller of Tucson is, it's Penn and Teller. We're,
No.
yeah. I think they've heard of us in Tucson.
I don't know what movie I'd see if I went to Tucson.
Well, it'd be a different movie. I mean, now? I've heard Guardians of the Galaxy 2. My children liked it. That's James Gunn. It's a good movie. I'd see that.
That's one with the talking raccoon?
I also want to see the James Baldwin movie. That's what I would see if it's still in theaters. There's a movie by James Baldwin. It's good. I would think it's good. I haven't seen it. I don't really see movies that much anymore.
Because of all the work you've been putting into Desert Bus?
I haven't done very much work at all. Matter of fact, most of the work I've done on Desert Bus, you've been here for in the room. That's what's kind of weird about it, because I'm talking about it here and I don't know much about it really, but there you go. Anyway, that's Desert Bus.
I want to thank you very much for coming on our program.
Thanks for having me.
Please, any other projects you have coming up, we'd love to have you back.
Thank you.
I'm a big fan.
Thanks a lot.
I never saw you off Broadway, but I bought a program off of eBay. And I like the program a lot.
Thank you. Thanks.
bought my cat a guitar. 'Cause everybody knows cats are supposed to be smarter than dogs. But he ain't learned how to play it yet. But hell, cats are smarter than dogs. And that cat ever learned how to play guitar. And that cat ever wrote a song. And it turned out to be a good song. You know, one that had some good lyrics and they actually had some meaning to them and had some good music behind it. Pretty hard group. Songs make you really feel something. Really make you wanna. Well, hell, they never gonna play a song on the radio. Cause when nobody wanna hear it, when nobody wanna buy it. Cause all the out there, they don't like good music. They don't like good movies. They like bullshit movies, bullshit music, bullshit TV shows. And never really read books. They did, they'd be bullshit books. Go and be the soundtrack of their bullshit lives. So I sold that cat's guitar. And then I sold that cat. And I bought me another dog. And I gave that dog a microphone. Now I got 2 dogs and 2 microphones. All I need is a drummer and a bass player. Bunch of tattoos and piercings and stupid names. And I have to be their producer. We'll make $1 million and just see us on MTV.
Welcome back to Bayes Talk, the advice show where we use Bayes' theorem to answer your relationship questions. We're almost out of time for this episode, so we're going to go to the lightning round. This is where we answer your questions as rapidly as we prudently are able. It's very exciting. Let's begin. Winslow Hayward asks, my son plays around on the video game machine, but I hear that causes people to become violent. Should I put a stop to it? The variable we wish to solve for with this question is probability that a person commits a violent crime, given the fact that person plays violent video games. To solve for this, we need the probability of a person committing a violent crime, the probability of a person playing violent video games, and the probability that someone who commits a violent crime plays violent video games. For simplicity, and I believe this is supported anecdotally, we will assume that anyone who is likely to commit a violent crime is also drawn to violence in their entertainment. So we will set that probability at 1.0. The U.S. violent crime rate in 2015 was 372.6 for every 100,000 people. And assuming each crime was committed by a different person, that makes the probability of committing a crime 0.3726%, or 0.003726. The percentage of people who enjoy violent video games is harder to measure, but since we used such a loose definition as violence in entertainment to give us the 1.0 for violence given crime, the numerator, we are constrained to use the same definition in the denominator, which gives us a conservative value of 3 and 4, or 0.75. Bayes' theorem, then, is 1.0 times 372.6 in 100,000 divided by 3 and 4, giving us 621 for every 125,000, or 4.968 times 10 to the negative 3, or 0.4968%, less than half a percent chance that someone who enjoys violent entertainment will commit a violent crime. The actual number is significantly lower than that, since some people commit multiple crimes. Not everybody who commits a violent crime necessarily enjoys violent entertainment, and of course, correlation does not equal causation. Hayden Litchfield asks, "My fiancé has just confessed to cheating on me with a coworker. He swears it was a one-time thing, but before he left his ex-wife, he was cheating on her with me. Given the base probability that our marriage will end in divorce of 0.53, the odds of him cheating, which are currently at 1.0, and the percentage of divorces that occur because of cheating, which my research puts at 17%, the probability that our marriage will end in divorce is 0.0901, or roughly 9%. Am I good?" No, Hayden, you are not good. First, base probability of divorce is 54% for first marriages only. For second marriages, it's 67%. Next, only 22% of married men cheat. This means your probability is closer to 51.77%. Paige Weston writes, "My mother-in-law disapproves of everything I do. Nothing I do is good enough. Is there any way to win her approval?" No. The probability of a mother-in-law approving of her son's wife is 0, making the problem phase invariant. Lewis Cromwell asks, "I got a parking space right by the entrance to the mall. Doesn't that prove that angels exist, and therefore so does God?" The likelihood of angels existing based on you getting a parking space presupposes that angels like you better than everyone else that was trying to get a parking space at that time, and that they prioritize the allotment of parking spaces over other divine interventions, like, for instance, feeding starving babies on the other side of the planet. The likelihood that angels prefer you over the other people trying to park that day is the likelihood that they'd give you a parking space if they did, which we'll say is 0.9, times the base odds of them preferring you in general, say 1 in 20, assuming moderate traffic at an average mall, divided by the overall odds of you getting a space, which are 0.9 times 0.05 plus 0.1 times 0.95, or 0.14. This puts the odds of angels preferring you to others, given you got the parking space, at 32.15%. This number naturally changes based on your success at getting parking spaces on future attempts. If under identical conditions you subsequently don't get a parking space, the equation becomes 0.1 times 0.3215 divided by 0.86, making the probability that angels have intervened, given the fact you didn't get the space, 0.0374, or 3.74%. This equation can't directly determine whether angels exist, but can begin to indicate the character of those angels if they do. If you find better than average parking more often than predicted by chance, your angels, if they exist, are probably evil. This by extension predicts the character of the God who created the angels. The probability of a good God assuming evil angels is the probability of evil angels assuming a good God, which we'll say is roughly 1 in 100, times the odds of a good God, which are 52% according to a CNN opinion poll, divided by the odds of evil angels, which are 32% the first time you get a good parking space. The solution to this equation is 2.26%. Again, this isn't the likelihood of God existing, but the likelihood of him being good if his angels are evil. To get a very rough idea of what your parking space implies, let's assume that because 77% of people believe in angels, there's a 77% chance that angels exist. And similarly, since 89% of people believe in a God, there's an 89% chance that a God exists. Your parking space, then, indicates a 21.53% chance that an evil deity spawned depraved demonic creatures that have, on at least one occasion, interacted directly with you, perhaps believe you owe them a favor, and may at this time be observing you and considering what to do with you or your loved ones in the future. Thanks for writing in. I'm Douglas Plainfield, and you've been listening to Bays Talk.
Travelers, and welcome to another exciting and dynamic episode of Larry J. DeVille's Quiz 5 with your host, yours truly, Larry J. DeVille. And for those travelers new to the Larry J. DeVille's Quiz 5, here's how it works. I will give a quiz question, and then I will list all of the options for the possible answers, and you must wait until I list the final option before you say your answer aloud. I will give 10 seconds to give your answer, and the first person to give the correct answer gets a point. At the end of the game, which is only 5 questions long, the person who has the most points wins the game. Alright, travelers, let's get our hands right into it. Here is the first question on Larry J. DeVille's Quiz 5 with your host, Larry J. DeVille. Yours truly. Question number 1. The cottonwood tree, not to be confused with the Plains cottonwood tree, but the cottonwood tree is the state tree of what state? Is it A, Alabama, B, Alaska, C, Arizona, D, Arkansas, E, California, F, Colorado, G, Connecticut, H, Delaware, I, Florida, J, Georgia, K, Hawaii, L, Idaho, M, Illinois, N, Indiana, O, Iowa, P, Kansas, Q, Kentucky, R, Louisiana, S, Maine, T, Maryland, U, Massachusetts, V, Michigan, W, Minnesota, X, Mississippi, Y, Missouri, Z, Montana, AA, Nebraska, BB, Nevada, CC, New Hampshire, DD, New Jersey, EE, New Mexico, FF, New York, GG, North Carolina, HH, North Dakota, II, Ohio, JJ, Oklahoma, KK, Oregon, LL, Pennsylvania, MM, Rhode Island, NN, South Carolina, OO, South Dakota, PP, Tennessee, QQ, Texas, RR, Utah, SS, Vermont, TT, Virginia, UU, Washington, VV, West Virginia, WW, Wisconsin, or XX, Wyoming. You have 10 seconds to answer. If you were the first person to say P, Kansas, you are awarded 1 point. Rolling on with the next question on Larry J. DeVille's Quiz 5 with your host, yours truly, Larry J. DeVille. Question number 2. Lawrence, Kansas is a city that is host to a public university. The University of, is it A, Alabama, B, Alaska, C, Arizona, D, Arkansas, E, California, F, Colorado, G, Connecticut, H, Delaware, I, Florida, J, Georgia, K, Hawaii, L, Idaho, M, Illinois, N, Indiana, O, Iowa, P, Kansas, Q, Kentucky, R, Louisiana, S, Maine, T, Maryland, U, Massachusetts, V, Michigan, W, Minnesota, X, Mississippi, Y, Missouri. Z, Montana. AA, Nebraska. BB, Nevada. CC, New Hampshire. DD, New Jersey. EE, New Mexico. FF, New York. GG, North Carolina. HH, North Dakota. II, Ohio. JJ, Oklahoma. KK, Oregon. LL, Pennsylvania. MM, Rhode Island. NN, South Carolina. OO, South Dakota. PP, Tennessee. QQ, Texas. RR, Utah. SS, Vermont. TT, Virginia. UU, Washington. VV, West Virginia. WW, Wisconsin. Or XX, Wyoming. You have 10 seconds to answer. If you were the first person to say P, Kansas, you are awarded 1 point. You are listening to Larry J. DeVille's Quiz 5 with your host, yours truly, Larry J. DeVille, and we continue on with question number 3. Kansas City is a city in the state of Missouri, but it is also a city in the state of, is it A, Alabama, B, Alaska, C, Arizona, D, Arkansas, E, California, F, Colorado, G, Connecticut, H, Delaware, I, Florida, J, Georgia, K, Hawaii, L, Idaho, M, Illinois, N, Indiana, O, Iowa, P, Kansas, Q, Kentucky, R, Louisiana, S, Maine, T, Maryland, U, Massachusetts, V, Michigan, W, Minnesota, X, Mississippi, Y, Missouri, Z, Montana, AA, Nebraska, BB, Nevada, CC, New Hampshire, DD, New Jersey, EE, New Mexico, FF, New York, GG, North Carolina, HH, North Dakota, II, Ohio, JJ, Oklahoma, KK, Oregon, LL, Pennsylvania, MM, Rhode Island, NN, South Carolina, OO, South Dakota, PP, Tennessee, QQ, Texas, RR, Utah, SS, Vermont, TT, Virginia, UU, Washington, VV, West Virginia, WW, Wisconsin, or XX, Wyoming. You have 10 seconds to answer. If you were the first person to say P, Kansas, you are awarded 1 point. You are listening to Larry J. DeVille's Quiz 5 with your host, yours truly, Larry J. DeVille. And we're going to continue on, travelers, with question number 4. Nebraska, Oklahoma, Missouri, and Colorado border which same state? Is it A, Alabama, B, Alaska, C, Arizona, D, Arkansas, E, California, F, Colorado, G, Connecticut, H, Delaware, I, Florida, J, Georgia, K, Hawaii, L, Idaho, M, Illinois, N, Indiana, O, Iowa, P, Kansas, Q, Kentucky, R, Louisiana, S, Maine, T, Maryland, U, Massachusetts, V, Michigan, W, Minnesota, X, Mississippi, Y, Missouri, Z, Montana, AA, Nebraska, BB, Nevada, CC, New Hampshire, DD, New Jersey, EE, New Mexico, FF, New GG, North Carolina, HH, North Dakota, II, Ohio, JJ, Oklahoma, KK, Oregon, LL, Pennsylvania, MN, Rhode Island, NN, South Carolina, OO, South Dakota, PP, Tennessee, QQ, Texas, RR, Utah, SS, Vermont, TT, Virginia, UU, Washington, VV, West Virginia, WW, Wisconsin, or XX, Wyoming. You have 10 seconds to answer. If you were the first person to say P, Kansas, you are awarded 1 point. Well, travelers, you and I are rounding third. Coming home. Question 5 is coming up next, but I feel like you and I made a connection today. Did you feel challenged? Well, if so, I am glad I was able to play a part in your journey of not just success, but significance. Okay, question number 5 today on Larry J. DeVille's Quiz 5 with your host, yours truly, Larry J. DeVille. The band Kansas was named after which state? Is it A, Alabama, B, Alaska, C, Arizona, D, Arkansas, E, California, F, Colorado, G, Connecticut, H, Delaware, I, Florida, J, Georgia, K, Hawaii, L, Idaho, M, Illinois, N, Indiana, O, Iowa, P, Kansas, Q, Kentucky, R, Louisiana, S, Maine, T, Maryland, U, Massachusetts, V, Michigan, W, Minnesota, X, Mississippi, Y, Missouri, Z, Montana, AA, Nebraska, BB, Nevada, CC, New Hampshire, DD, New Jersey, EE, New Mexico, FF, New York, GG, North Carolina, HH, North Dakota, II, Ohio, JJ, Oklahoma, KK, Oregon, LL, Pennsylvania, MN, Rhode Island, NN, South Carolina, OO, South Dakota, PP, Tennessee, QQ, Texas, RR, Utah, SS, Vermont, TT, Virginia, UU, Washington, VV, West Virginia, WW, Wisconsin, or XX, Wyoming. You have 10 seconds to answer. If you were the first person to say P, Kansas, you are awarded 1 point. Well, fellow travelers, that is all the time that we have today. I am Larry J. DeVille, and keep on journeying.
Hello, welcome to another edition of Classical Music Moment. I am, as always, your host, Dr. Julian Peterson. Today, radio audience, we have in store a real treat. We're going to listen to one of my personal favorite works, From the New World, the Ninth Symphony of Dvorak. Today we'll be focusing specifically on the second movement. Now, as you know, this work was written at the end of the 19th century. Specifically, it was written in 1893, and even though Dvorak is a Czech composer, at the time, he was living in New York, and he was the director of the National Conservatory of Music of America. that school existed from 1885 until 1952. Dvorak served only a handful of years, but in 1893 he composed this glorious work. Now, it's been said that early on, Dvorak made the claim that the work was based on American folk songs, though he later retracted that. I'm not aware of any specific folk songs that are used in the piece. But, as you know, Dvorak is a master of melody. Everywhere we find songs that could be folk songs, beautiful melodies, dances, songs that lift one's spirit. Yes, radio audience, today is truly a blessed day, and every day is a blessed day when we have music in our lives. I'm so grateful that on this day I get to share music with you. Normally, we like to take a little time and discuss the works before we listen. Today, I'd like to get right into it. This work is so beautiful, I think we should hop right in. Nonetheless, as you know, our motto here at Classical Music Moment is, an informed listener is an informed listener. And in that spirit, I do have a few short introductory remarks prepared. To start, let's state the obvious. This work is beautiful. You have a real treat ahead. Structurally, from the broad view, is a very simple piece. A, B, A form. A classical form, you'll forgive me. However, the devil is in the details, and as we look into this piece a bit more, we'll discover that just underneath of that simplicity is a treasure trove of techniques and motions and movements, moments of beauty and compositional restraint, as you shall see. Now, Dvorak is in this piece is a late 19th century piece, and so we can expect to see the sorts of devices that we would find in late 19th century music. There is a tendency to favor plagal cadences over more traditional cadences. There is a strong emphasis on the interval of the third. As I like to say, Dvorak uses thirds like Haydn uses fifths. I know you're all chuckling about that one. Well, let's dive right in. This work begins with a curious introduction. Now, I suspect, in the context of the full symphony, of course, we would have been listening to the first movement, and I think these first few measures are a means of Dvorak transitioning us into the much gentler material of the second movement. We begin with a brass fanfare. Now, I'm going to read the names of these chords to you so that you'll understand with me just how shocking some of these transitions are. The piece is in the key of D flat major, and yet the very first chord that we will hear is E major. What is E major in the key of D flat? Well, it's not really a chord in that key at all. In fact, it would be flat 3 major. That initial E is followed by a B flat chord, E flat major. Now you're thinking to yourself, E to B flat, that's a tritone, and yes, you're right, that is a dramatic shift in harmony. It is softened somewhat by the bass, which, instead of leaping the tritone, progresses down by a whole step to land on D. So actually the chord, the second chord, is a B flat in first inversion. Then we return to E. Now we are on the fourth chord. We have a D flat major triad. This is the first time we've heard the tonic of the piece. However, at this point, we don't know that it's the tonic of the piece. Chords continue. We get a B double flat major chord, followed by a G flat minor chord, finally arriving at D flat major. We'll talk more about the B double flat chord. Actually, that chord will come back at several pivotal moments in this piece. Skipping past that, we get to the G flat minor chord. In the key of D flat, this is a borrowed minor 4, and we get the cadence minor 4, 1. Really, it's a striking movement, and keep that in mind because we'll hear that particular motion come back later on in the piece too. Now we've arrived at the fifth measure. We have a couple of bars where the strings just lay out that tonic chord, giving us a chance to savor and adjust to the fact that we have now arrived in the key of B flat. And there, as if off in the distance, you will hear solo English horn state our melody. La da da dee dee da, la da dee da da. See, as I said, Dvorak is a master of melody. This could be a folk song. This could be a nursery song. In fact, it features, this is interesting, as you radio audience well know, my wife is a researcher in music education, and she once pointed out to me that quite a few children's songs alternate between the third of a major scale and the fifth of a major scale, the motion so to me, so me, so me. We hear lots of melodies that start that way. So me, do, so me, so me. Now, why is it that so many children's songs feature this interval? I cannot quite say. I suspect it might be easier for young voices to traverse the minor third than it would be for them to traverse the major third if we were to do what might be more expected. Me, do, that sort of motion. Anyways, back to our melody. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Starting here in the 7th bar, that English horn solo. Now, the sonorities here are quite simple. First bar, giant 1 chord, as the melody is. Mi, so, mi, re, do. The second bar, we move to the 5 chord. Re, mi, so, mi, re. However, the 5 chord has underneath it a 1 pedal. So we're just hearing that D flat just continue in the bass. Moving on, now we're in the 9th bar. La dee dee da da da, dee 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 da da. Now something really surprising happens here. In the 9th bar, the first chord is, as we would expect, the 1 chord. The second chord, something surprising happens, actually. We get A flat from the 1 chord, moving up chromatically to an A natural. Now this always causes a dilemma for the analyst, because we have a tone that's outside of the signature, and so we always have to explain that. Especially, this isn't treated as a passing tone. We land on this A natural and stay on it for a full 2 beats. And at this tempo, a full 2 beats is, well, it can be quite a long time, as you can imagine. So, we have this A natural. Now, typically, when we move brighter or sharper, in this case moving from flat to natural as we raise a pitch, generally our expectation would be that it would continue to rise and we would get to our next stable chord tone or key tone moving up. And that is what happens here. That A natural does eventually resolve up to the B flat. Now you might think, okay, if we have an A natural resolving up to B flat, that sounds like a secondary dominant. We probably expect that we're going to have an F7 chord moving to the B flat minor 7. However, we don't have C natural. Dvorak denies us C natural and instead holds on to the D flat. Now that gives us a very beautiful turn of events, because now we have F, A natural, and B flat, an augmented triad. Augmented triads are dissonant by their nature. They require resolution. And happily, we are given that resolution on the very next bar. I'm going to call this chord Augmented 5 of 6, because it's functioning as an augmented dominant chord leading to that B flat. What's clever here is that as we get to the 10th bar, where we would expect that B flat minor chord, instead given a G flat major chord. So that's very interesting. If we had an F augmented 5 chord, it resolves deceptively to its 6th, which is of course 4 in our key of B flat. Now we have a very common cadential formula. The 4 chord rises up by the next beat to the 5-7 chord, finally resolving on 1. Now that closes the first 4 bars of our melody. This is a nice symmetrical sort of structure here, because we have la da da dee dee da, la da dee dee da, la da dee 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 da, la da dee da da. So we have that first bar repeated again at the 3rd bar, and we have the expectation that the 2nd bar sets up by arriving on the 2nd scale degree, resolved finally in that 4th measure, resolve on 1. Now that we've finished the first 4 bars of the melody, what you will hear is a extended exploration of 4. So the bass moves up to G flat, and we get up in the melody an exploration, let's say. Something like la da da dee da dum, la da dee da dum. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I know I've received letters from you before, and I will happily confess to you, I am not blessed with perfect pitch. I have no idea what key I'm singing in. But I do know that it's beautiful, and I know that when you hear it in the recording, here in just a few moments, it will be in the key of G flat. Now, that little melody that we heard, that two-bar statements, la da da dee da 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 dee da da, it's repeated again, la da da dee da 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 dee da da, and all of this over a 4 pedal. So we've now, for 4 measures, savored the 4 chord, and it resolves to 1 in a plagal cadence. Turn to our opening melody. La da da dee dee da, la da dee dee da, la da da, la da da. I'm gonna stop there because a truly beautiful thing just happened. So the first time we heard this melody, we heard the first bar, 3 rising to 5, and then 3 falling to 1. 3, 5, 5, 3, 2, 1. We heard that again on the repetition 2 bars later. 3, 5, 5, 3, 2, 1. Here, where the melody comes back, we first hear that same thing again. 3, 5, 5, 3, 2, 1. And now, that's our expectation. But Dvorak twists things on us. Instead of 3 rising to 5, followed by 3 falling to 1, we get 3 rising to 5, leaping up to 1, the higher tonic, and then rising to 3, inverting that second interval. So, la da da, la da da, now reaching the highest note of our melody. While that's happening, cleverly, Dvorak places a descending line in the bass. So as our melody is rising to new heights, our bass, which has frankly been quite stagnant this whole time, either being a pedal on 1 with just slight motions, or the pedal on 4, now we actually get a downward scalar motion. 1, 7, 6, 5, and then it holds that 5 through and through. So, back to our melody. La da da la da dee ya da dee ya da, reaching our point of resolution. This is followed by an echo. We hear the exact same statement again, that last measure. La da dee da da, repeating 4-1, the plagal cadence, and the harmonies supporting that. Then we hear the echo one more time. This time, however, we hear the echo in rhythmic augmentation. So as before, where we had a dotted 8th note, 16th note, pair of 8th notes, half note, now we have dotted quarter note, 8th note, pair of quarter notes, whole note. So I'll sing all 3 parts of that. So la da dee da dum, then the echo, la da dee da dum, and then the echo augmented, la da da. We can take that whole exchange there, those 3 bars, the final statement of the melody plus the 2 echoes, as a cadential extension to round out that opening phrase. Now when we land at measure 21, for those of you keeping track on your note cards, on measure 21, we've reached the resolution of that final echo, and we get a rising triplet gesture through the registers of the orchestra. Dum, 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 dum. We finally arrive at a D flat chord and a symmetry to the opening chorale that we heard in the brass. Now, initially, you'll recall, we started on an E major chord. This time, however, we've arrived at our tonic at D flat. Spoiler alert, at the end of this exchange, we're still going to be in E flat. So as before, where we were starting on E and descending the minor third, here we're starting on D flat and remaining on D flat. That forces Dvorak's hand to rewrite this material a little bit. Now, it begins the same, whereas before we had E followed by B flat, that movement of a tritone that was so alarming. Here we have D flat moving to G, and as before, not a root position G chord, but a G chord in first inversion, so we get that whole step movement in the bass. D flat, G, back to D flat. Now, as before, following the minor third, B flat major chord. The next motion, however, it breaks from what had done before. We follow the B flat chord with a G flat major chord. The G flat major chord is 4 in our key of D flat. That is followed by an E flat minor chord, 2 in our key, and one of the voices halfway through that chord. These are half notes, so 1 quarter note later, the voices that were playing B flat have moved up to C. Now, you might think of this as just a passing tone, and I would forgive you for that. That's a perfectly valid explanation. We could also view this as a C diminished triad, which would be 7 diminished in our key of D flat. I like that explanation because I like the motion of 2 to 7 diminished to 1 as a nice little cadential formula. However, 2 to 1 is a cadence that's acceptable in this period of time. We do see that as maybe a variation on the plagal motion of 4 to 1, and actually we'll see that motion happen again later in this work. But for now, I'll say E flat, C diminished, finally arriving on the D flat major triad. So we've repeated that opening material, but this time rearranged so that we remain in the key of D flat. There are a couple of measures where we continue to reaffirm the key of D flat. Now, for those of you paying attention at home, this would be bar 25 is when we arrive on the D flat chord, holding through in bar 26. It's not until bar 27 that we get a return of the melody. La da da dee da da. Now, you might recognize that as not the opening gesture of the melody, but actually the second part of the melody, which before we heard over a pedal G flat. This time, it is presented as a pedal over D flat. And that's actually only the beginning of the changes. Something truly interesting here. So, whereas before we had a pedal 4 chord, and a melody that would just repeat itself. Here we have a development of that idea. So we're going to start with that same material, but Dvorak takes it a little further. So, and the harmonies are changing here. Under that first bar, we had the 1 chord. By the time we get to that second bar, actually we have a shift, and we hear this as maybe a 6 chord. And then repeat. La da da dee da da. Moving to 6. La da dee da da. We repeat the 6 chord. La da dee da da. Now we get this. You'll recognize we've had this thirds gesture, this broken thirds idea. La da dee da dee da dee da. La da dee da dee da dee da. That idea is very important. So we have 2 lines I think I neglected to mention. We're hearing this in parallel thirds. So the thirds, as voices, are themselves thirds, but they are also articulating melodic thirds, and thirds which are falling. This creates a vagueness of key. When we just have descending thirds, it's hard to say when we're a chord and when we're decoration. But I do think we can say that we're starting in the key area of 6, and you can either think of it as remaining on 6 that whole time, or you can think of it as moving to 3 at the end of that bar. La da dee da dee da dee da. La da dee da dee da dee da. Now something interesting. Now we repeat only the last 2 beats. In fact, we have a metric shift here. Dvorak inserts a 2/4 bar that has otherwise been 4/4 time, just to repeat that last little gesture. And then we get to one of my favorite measures in the whole work, measure 35, where something really spectacular happens. But before we get there, la da dee da dee da dee da, la da dee da dee da dee da, dee da dee da da. Now, what you can't hear from my single voice is that as we reach that last note, and that is held in the melody, the startling harmonic shift happens in the bass. The first thing that happens is, on the downbeat, we affirm that we are on 6. We have a strong 6 chord in the key of B flat, that is B flat minor. Now, the voice that's playing F moves up to G flat. So that puts us in G flat major. Except we also, at that same moment, have a shift where B flat becomes B double flat. And if that's ringing bells for you, it ought to be, because we have that mysterious B double flat chord in the third measure of the work. I promised it would come back, and I always keep my promises. So, we move up to the G flat, the voice that was on F, and we move down to B double flat from B flat. That gives us a G flat minor chord. This is minor 4. That's outside of our key, but that's not too far off the mark, since minor 4 is a commonly borrowed chord. But the very next motion is even more alarming. So, the voice that has now become G flat divides, and divides into both an E natural and a G natural. So, my, let's take a quick stock here. So we have a B double flat, D flat, E natural, and G natural. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, what on earth chord could that be? When we are in this situation, radio audience, it's always best, I say, to try enharmonic spellings. Enharmonics, of course, being the idea that a note can have 2 different names. Sort of. So we could have a D flat, we could also call that a C sharp. Now, this is only true in equal temperament. Of course, we are in the age of equal temperament. In other temperaments, those things are not necessarily equivalent, and I suspect that for performers, psychologically, they're still not entirely equivalent. However, it is a common device to do in enharmonic modulation, where we arrive on a note from the context of one key, and then in our thinking, shift it to its mirror so that we can recontextualize that chord in a new key. And that's the exact situation I think we have here, or at least I'm going to entertain that idea for the moment. So instead of B double flat, let's call that A, and instead of D flat, let's call that C sharp. And now if I spell the chord A, C sharp, E, G, well, it's very clear what that chord is, isn't it? Now we're on an A dominant 7th chord. Although, that's its own mystery. What on earth is A dominant 7 doing in the key of D flat? Well, my enharmonic switch might have been useful for identifying the quality of this chord, but it has actually led us further from the truth. Let's go back to thinking about that A as a B double flat. To what note would you expect B double flat to resolve? That's absolutely correct to those of you playing at home. It would resolve down to the A flat. And, if you'll recall, in our middling voices, we had a G natural. G natural is a raised 4 in the key of D flat. We expect it to rise up to 5, so we would expect that G to go to A flat. So we have a B double flat resolving down to A flat, and we have a G resolving up to A flat. B double flat to G. B double flat to G. Spelled that way, we recognize that this is a 6th, but not any 6th, an augmented 6th. And since we have an augmented 6th, and we're outlining what feels like a dominant 7th chord, we can finally recognize this chord for what it is. This is a German augmented 6th chord in the key of D flat. The German augmented 6th chord has a traditional resolution. It wants to get to A flat. In fact, it is a strong predominant chord that's setting us up to hear A flat dominant 7. However, if you can imagine sliding from A7 to A flat 7, that's just a chromatic downward shift. That would introduce a number of parallels, most importantly the parallel fifths between I'm going to go back to calling these A and E, down to A flat and E flat. Since those are frowned upon, as we don't want to ruin our contrapuntal priorities here. Almost always there is a chord that is inserted between these, and since the 1-6-4 chord is already a common cadential formula, typically we would expect that this B double flat German augmented 6th chord would first resolve to a D-flat chord in second inversion, or a D-flat 6/4 chord, and then finally to the A-flat chord or A-flat 7 chord, depending on the whims of the composer at that particular time. But this is truly surprising because in this piece, here in measure 35, Dvorak holds that augmented sixth sonority through the end of the bar, only to resolve, in the next measure, to a root position 1 chord. This is a really surprising shift, although it's not unlike things we've seen before. Our root motion from A to D flat is the root motion of a rising third. That's not unlike the very second measure of the piece, where we went from an E major chord to a D flat chord, and we have that gesture of the falling third. In fact, that, plus the parallel thirds in the melody, and indeed just the overall treatment of thirds, and I think you can see why I made my little jest earlier about Dvorak treating thirds like Haydn treats fifths. Structurally, thirds are extremely important in this work. Here we've arrived at, what bar would this be? 34, 35, measure 36. We have the return of the melody. La-da-dee-ya-da-da, la-da-dee-dee-da-da. Did you catch that little variation right there? Just that extra little lift on the note. It's a nice moment. La-da-da, la-da-da, la-da-dee-ya-da. You'll probably recognize that movement to the higher tonic up to the third. We've had that before. That happened, we made reference to this in, what would that have been, measure 17. And at that time, you'll recall, I pointed out that as the melody is rising, we have contrary motion in the bass of the descending stepwise bass motion. Very lovely. Here, the same thing happens with a slight variation. Before, in the bass, we step down 1, 7, 6, 5, and then we held onto this 5, a pedal dominant through the beginning of the next bar. Here, we continue the motion all the way down to 4. So 1, 7, 6, 5, 4. You can tell I'm hitting the bottom of my range there. Excuse me, radio audience. We get to that 4. And that can finally resolve to 1 with the melody. 4, 1. Legal cadence. Oh, forgive me, ladies and gentlemen. I've lost track of where I am. This happens, I swear, this happens to me every week when we do this. And that's quite all right. We'll get back on track here. Our descending motion, that was in bar 38. 1, 7, 6, 5, 4. And la-da-dee-da-da. Then, as before, the echo, la-da-dee-da-da. And then, as before, the echo in augmentation. La-da-da. Now, this is a nice moment in the piece. Here, let's just recap. We've heard the melody. We've heard the melody as it moved to 4. We've heard it return back to 1. We took a cadential extension where we explored the resolution of the 1 chord for a while. We moved past that to a recapitulation of the very opening sequence of chords. That went on for a few bars, finally resolving on 1, and then we had this slight departure from the melody where we explored the 1 to 6, 1 to 6 in the falling thirds, finally arriving at that really crunchy German augmented sixth that I went on and on about. Here, resolving to the melody again, and our cadential extension again. And now, to really solidify the fact that we've reached the end, we find that Dvorak has extended the melody even more. So after our augmentation, now we hear the melody in horn fifths. I'll take a moment to explain the term horn fifths. As many of you know, if you've studied music at all, you know that direct fifths or parallel fifths are very frowned upon in contrapuntal writing. The reason being that usually in contrapuntal writing it is the goal of the composer to achieve independence of the voices. And independence is best achieved through 2 devices, I say. The first being contrary motion. If one voice is falling and another voice is rising, well, we can hardly confuse them, can we? And the other great device is oblique motion, that being where one voice holds steady while the other voice moves, and again, very difficult to confuse the voices in that context. Where things become tricky and require special attention is when voices move in similar motion, so both voices rising, both voices falling, etc. When two voices are moving in the same direction, if they land on a perfect interval, especially fifths and octaves, because of the similarity of motion and because of the pure consonance of that interval, it can readily happen that the voice seems to disappear, or at the very least is robbed of its power and its individuality. So by and large, it is a frowned upon movement for two voices in the same direction to arrive on a perfect interval. However, there is a classic historical exception to this, which is called horn fifths. Now, we're used to modern horns, which have valves, pistons, and lots of complex machinery. But historically, that's actually a fairly recent development. We would have generally had natural horns. Now, of course, in Dvorak's time, he had a much more modern instrument, so this is looking even further back in time. But if we do head even further back in time, we find natural horns, and natural horns are limited to playing notes in the harmonic series. So, you should try this experiment at home on your piano. If you hold down a note, let's pick one in the middle. Let's say middle C. Let's take all the uncertainty out of it. If you silently depress middle C, and you play very loudly the D that's right above it, hit that D just briefly, staccato, boom, you'll notice nothing unusual. By way of contrast, if instead of that D you played the C an octave lower, ball, you would find that the C that you were once silently holding, that string has started to ring in a sympathetic resonance. It is a property of strings and other acoustic bodies that they favor certain pitches, or maybe a better way of explaining it would be to say, when we hear the sound of a piano string, we do not hear a single tone, we hear a complex collusion of tones. And with careful analysis, we can break apart the constituents of that tone to learn more about it. Now, likewise, if I'm playing on a brass instrument, I have to vibrate my lips to get a certain pitch. However, the instrument will feed back energy to interact with my lips, and if I happen to be buzzing a tone that is, let's say, consonant or allowable with the length of horn that I've got, it will reinforce the flapping of my lips, and we'll have a nice, strong, solid tone. If, on the other hand, I try to perform a note that's not a natural resonance of the length of horn that I'm playing, I actually won't get that feedback. It would be very difficult to sustain. It would have no power. In fact, we could say it's not even a note on the instrument. Okay, so our harmonic series, whatever our lowest note is, the lowest note that we can sustain on a given length of pipe, we can also play one octave above that. That would be the first overtone or the second harmonic. Going forward, I prefer to use harmonic numbering instead of overtone numbering. So the second harmonic would be the next octave up. The third harmonic, the next note we could play, would be the fifth above that, followed by the next octave above that. Now as we go up, we would have the major third, then the fifth, then flat 7, come back to this, followed by 1. Now you may notice that the intervals are compressing. Our first interval was an octave, C to C. The second one a fifth, C to G. The next one a fourth, G to C. Now, going up, we go C to E, a major third, E to G, a minor third. Now here's where it gets interesting. E to the B flat. The B flat that we are used to in equal temperament is not the B flat that we would find in the harmonic series. In fact, it's much flatter, which should seem obvious to us because the intervals are getting smaller, and the last one we had was a minor third, so this one couldn't be a minor third, and yet it's not so small as to be a second. So we have a very flat dominant 7th or minor 7th note, followed by, finally, the octave just above that. In Baroque music, think of Baroque trumpet playing, you can recall your favorite pieces. in those pieces, in order to have lots of notes close to one another, the instrumentalist has to play actually very high in the instrument's range. They have to be in a very high tessitura for that instrument in order to have a compressed set of pitches that they can play. The lower they go on the instrument, the more spread out they become. Now, valves fix this because with valves you can change the length of the pipe, and that allows you to hit notes that are in between the notes of the harmonic series. That probably explains a fashion shift that has occurred in brass playing. In the Baroque era, brass instruments would have played very high on their instruments, so they had access to lots of pitches. Going forward in time, once we have valves, that wouldn't be a requirement. You could play lower in the instrument, probably a more comfortable range. And indeed, typically, Doc Severinsen aside, we find that trumpet players tend to occupy a lower space on the instrument than maybe they would have historically. I've gotten off track. Let's return to these horn fifths. So, if I rise up the harmonic series, I finally got to that octave right above that minor seventh, a very flat note. If I keep going up, the next notes are 2 and 3. I finally have a little segment of the scale, 1, 2, 3. If I want to write a melody that descends 3, 2, 1, as Dvorak has done here, 3, 2, 1, and I want to harmonize that melody with another horn, that other horn, well, it could play 1, so it could have 1 against 3. As the upper voice moves down to D, I could have the lower voice move down to that flat minor seventh, but for the fact that it's probably not the chord tone that we want, and worse, it's not in tune. So we're going to skip that one. So my lower voice would have to go down to the fifth. If we'll speak in the key of C major here. So if my upper voice has fallen from E to D, my lower voice has gone from C to G. And then we could continue. The upper voice could fall to 1, the lower voice could fall to 1. Now, we've actually violated a rule twice here, if you'll recall. So we're 2 voices, both descending. The upper one, when it moves to the D, the lower voice leaps down to the G. And this would be a direct fifth, or a hidden fifth. Now, those of you that are more pedantic about theory, you might say, but wait, I recall learning that this is only a problem if there's a leap in the melody. And indeed, that's true. And in fact, that's probably true because of this exact situation where this horn fifths overtone dilemma would have caused the sound of stepwise motion in the upper voice with a leap in the lower voice to be acceptable in similar motion. But if we're being real strictlers, we could say that this is a violation of that idea of the following two voices moving to a perfect interval. And then, to make matters even worse, the very next interval would be moving to an octave. So we would have gone from a fifth to an octave, same problem, descending motion. Nonetheless, this is considered an acceptable substitution, or an acceptable case, let's say, for this direct fifths motion. And it's a very common sound. So here, now again, we're in the 42nd measure of this piece. Here we have horn fifths re-articulating the melody. 3, 2, 1, 3, 2, 1, and 1, 5, 1, 1, 5, 1, sounding together. And a miraculous transformation takes place. They get quieter, quieter with each repetition until we are left with just a single voice, thus ending the section. Now a big shift occurs. Now we have arrived at Un poco più mosso. This section is in C sharp minor. This is an enharmonic shift like the one we discussed before. We were in D flat major. We could be in D flat minor, but that's an uncomfortable number of flats, if you know what I mean. So instead, we'll call this C sharp minor. And we're introduced to a new melody. This melody is actually remarkably similar to the first melody, in the sense that this melody starts on the minor third and falls to 1. Now, before we had started on, we were playing with like 3 and 5 in the key of D flat. Here we're playing with 1 and 3 in the key of C sharp minor, but it's the same interval at the minor third. This time animated, though, with more stepwise motion and more motion in general. La di da da, da di da di di da da, la di da ya da da di ya da 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 da. There's a few things that I really like about this passage. First of all, let's talk about the harmony. It's always important to talk about harmony. We're in C sharp minor, we're on the 1 chord, At the half note, we move to minor 4-6. So if you're paying attention, we were C sharp minor. This would be an F sharp minor chord, but since it's in first inversion, our root motion would be C sharp moving down to A. And then we repeat that material. La da 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 dee da. So that same motion happens. When we get to the third bar, things get very interesting. So la da 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 dee dee da. Here's the third bar. La da da dee ya da 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 dee ya. That first triplet. La da da dee. That's B natural going up to C sharp natural with the G sharp in between there. La da da dee. This is harmonized by a 5 chord, but not a major 5 as we would probably expect, but a minor 5. Usually in minor we find the raised 7th scale degree, and that's so that we give the 5 chord the same resolving power, or maybe the same resolving potential that it has in the major key, especially if you consider the case of the dominant 7, where we would want that tritone motion to collapse inward as part of the resolution. Here, however, Dvorak is affecting a more peasant dance or a more folk song approach, so it stays more strictly modal. So instead of the B being raised to B sharp, we'll stick with B natural. La da da dee ya da 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 dee ya. So our chords here, we have that minor 5 that resolves to a 1-6-4, so a 1 chord in second inversion. So we're maintaining the 5 in the bass. That is followed by a somewhat mysterious chord, and when I first got here, I wrote down minor 4-7. That's not unheard of, but that's not the most common. That is followed by a flat 7 major chord. Well, now I'm starting to get uncomfortable. Anytime I write flat 7 major, I think, something else is probably happening here. There may yet be a better explanation, and indeed there is. The very next chord of the following bar is an E major chord, which we could call 3 in the key of C sharp minor, but I think it's actually better if we retreat backwards by 2 chords. That chord that I had written down is 4-7. If we think of it in the key of E, that F sharp minor chord is actually better understood as a 2-7 chord, and that makes the very next chord, the one we had called flat 7 major, as a dominant chord in the key of E, finally resolving to E on the downbeat. This is only a temporary modulation. In fact, let's not even use the word modulation. I prefer to think of this as a tonicization. This is very temporary because by the very next beat, we're already departing from that resolution, or that quasi-resolution that we had on E, and making our way back to the C sharp minor. When we get to the piece and we listen to it, you'll notice in that moment there is a very brief shift to this major harmony that's just then immediately robbed from us as we get back to the C sharp. So that whole passage. La di da da, la di da ya da da da, ya di da di ya da da ya da 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 da, la da da di. Now repetition. La da da da, la di da ya da da da, la di da 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 da. A beautiful moment. You'll forgive my singing, ladies and gentlemen. I've had to apologize for my singing before. So, as you heard, this was a variation from the first time we heard this melody, and I just want to point out something that I find very interesting in this. There's already been a lot of play rhythmically. This has been implied by my singing, but I'll spell it out now. We begin with a triplet. That's followed by duples. Da 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 dum, da dee da ya da da dum, da dee dum. In that next passage, we have triplets, a quarter note, and then 16th notes. Ya da da dee.